There are other methods of choosing color when you're working on a web image other than the traditional color picker. One of those is the new HUD color picker. HUD stands for Heads Up Display, which means that I can bring up this color picker on the fly while I'm using another tool, like a painting tool, without having to stop what I'm doing and go into a separate window as I do with the traditional color picker. To invoke the HUD color picker, I'm going to hold down 3 keys on my Mac, the Control key, the Option key, and the Command key, as I click inside an open image. On the PC, I would hold down the Shift key plus the Alt key as I right-click inside an open image, and then I can release my keyboard shortcuts. I still have my mouse held down, however. The ring of color on the outside of the HUD color picker represents various hues. Right now, a red hue is selected. If I want to select a different shade of that hue, in other words, a different combination of brightness and saturation, I can move this little circle around inside of the square in the HUD color picker. So if I move over here, for example, I'll be selecting a saturated and bright shade of the red hue. I still have my mouse held down because now what I'd like to do is to keep this shade selected, but change the hue. If I were to move my mouse out to that color ring to do that, I would lose the shade that I have selected. So I'm going to lock down the shade by holding down the space bar and moving my cursor out and over this circle on the color ring. Then I can release the space bar and drag the circle around the color ring to select a different hue. Notice as I'm doing this that the foreground color in the foreground color box in the toolbox is changing. Now that I have a combination of shade and hue that I want, I'll release my mouse to set my foreground color. Sometimes the best way to select colors is by sampling colors from another image. The eyedropper tool is great for that. I'm going to select the eyedropper tool here in the toolbox, and then I'm going to come into this image and say I'd like to select this particular beige color. All I have to do is click on that color. When I press down on my mouse, by default, I see this new feature called the sampling ring. The sampling ring shows the color that I'm sampling in the top half of the inner ring, and it shows the last foreground color in the bottom half of the inner ring. And the outer ring is just a neutral color to set all this off so I can see it. I'll release my mouse, and now my foreground color is set to beige. If I don't like the sampling ring, I can always turn it off by unchecking Show Sampling Ring in the options bar for the eyedropper tool. There's another useful feature in the options bar for this tool, and that is the Sample menu, from which I can choose All Layers or Current Layer. I'll leave that set to All Layers for now, and I want you to take a look at the Layers panel, where you'll notice that I have 2 layers in this file. The bottom layer is green, and the top layer contains this circular logo with several different colors in it. If I were to click on top of this wave with all layers selected in the options bar, no matter which layer I have selected in the Layers panel, the eyedropper tool will sample the color on the topmost layer. So if I click right here, my foreground color changes to blue. But look what happens if I go to the Sample menu and I change that to Current Layer. And in the Layers panel, I have the green background layer selected. Now if I click on top of that blue wave, the color that is selected is green, not blue, because the color is being sampled from the highlighted background layer. There are a couple of other features from which I can select color in Photoshop. One of those is the Color panel. To open the Color panel, I'm going to click on this icon. If I don't have this icon on my screen, I can always go up to the Window menu and choose Color. The Color panel has 3 sliders, which by default represent the red, green, and blue components in the RGB color mode. I can drag these sliders to mix my own foreground color, and as I do, the foreground color box in the Color panel is changing, as well as the foreground color box in the toolbox. There's also a color ramp here that I can use as a starting point for a particular hue. So if I click here, for example, I have a shade of yellow in the foreground color box, and then I can use the sliders to fine-tune that color. If I want to limit the colors to Web Safe Colors, I can come to the Panel menu on the Color panel, and from here choose Web Color Sliders, and that limits the colors that I can mix to Web Safe Colors. I'm going to click this double-pointed arrow to close the Color panel for now to show you one more panel from which I can select colors in Photoshop, and that's the Swatches panel. In the Swatches panel, all I do to set a foreground color is click on one of these small color swatches, and as I do, the foreground color in the foreground color box is changing in the toolbox. Right now I'm looking at the default set of swatches. If I want different swatches in the Swatches panel than this default set, there are several ways that I can customize this panel, and that's what I'm going to show you how to do in the very next movie. So there are multiple methods of choosing color when you're working on an image for the web in Photoshop CS5. No one method is always better than another. Use the one that's most appropriate for the task you're working on.